Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Frank Fukuyama. I am the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law here at Stanford. Alberto is one of our senior fellows there. Basically what we do is research on democratic institutions around the world, but we also like the practical side of things because we think democracy is a good thing, and so we work on solutions on how to build strong democracies everywhere. So normally I'd like to be down in the trenches talking with you about practical things that can be done to promote peace in Latin America, but I'm actually going to start at about a 30,000 foot level because I think it might actually be a good introduction to the general, what I regard as the specific problem of Latin America as a region. Latin America is different from Asia, and it's different from Europe and North America in the following sense. Countries in Latin America do not fight interstate wars with each other, by and large. So in terms of external relations, it's one of the most peaceful parts of the world. On the other hand, Latin Americans love to fight intrastate wars. Almost all of their militaries and the violence is consumed in insurgencies, in criminal activity, in other kinds of social conflicts within each individual country. This is not a new phenomenon. I mean, it's very present to all of us now because of the rise of narco-trafficking and the like, but this has really, really deep roots in the region. The sociologist Miguel Centeno probably did the foundational work on this. So in political science, there's Charles Tilly has one of the few generally applicable theories about state formation, in which he says that states make war and war makes states. And he argues that in early modern Europe, one of the reasons that you got the emergence of powerful territorial states beginning in the 16th, 17th centuries was that the Europeans were just fighting each other continuously. And this is a process that continued really up until the end of World War II in 1945. And he has a lot of data in which he shows the number of battle deaths, for example, per million population in Europe, in East Asia, and in Latin America. And by far, Latin America is the lowest of all of these. And if you learn Latin American history, if you learn European history, it's just one damn war after another. If you learn Latin American history, who's ever heard of the Chaco War or knows anything about it, or the War of the Triple Alliance? I mean, there were occasional interstate wars, but they were actually quite rare. So in that sense, Latin America is a zone of peace. And then the question that naturally arises is, why are there so few wars fought in this region relative to Asia and to Europe? And that, I think, has to do with a number of social and geographical characteristics. Let's begin with the geography, the physical geography. So Jared Diamond pointed this out a long time ago. Latin America is very difficult terrain for mobility. And you actually don't get powerful states unless you can move armies around. Most of the corridors in Latin America actually run north to south across different climatic zones. That's why he argues that certain technologies didn't spread as rapidly in Latin America as they did in Eurasia, where you basically had these open steppes and Mongols could ride thousands of miles and conquer very large territories. In Latin America, the place is cut up in a way that makes it very difficult for any state to really consolidate its territorial reach. You look at Colombia, you got all these cordilleras that cut the country into these narrow valleys, and so to this day, the Colombian state has not been able to exert territorial jurisdiction in very large parts of the country. My favorite little fact is that despite the fact that Panama and Colombia were once part of the same country, there's not a single road that connects those two countries today because of the difficulty of the terrain and the jungle there. So that's one factor. So Montesquieu said that in Europe, it was suitable to the development of democracy because you had these large territories that were open where you could create states like France or Spain or Germany, but it was also cut up by mountain ranges, large rivers that prevented the creation of a universal empire. A lot of people tried. Alexander I, Napoleon, Hitler, and very few of them were successful. And so it was kind of in between where you could have strong individual states, but it was very hard to create a despotic empire that controlled the whole of the continent. Latin America is kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum, where it was even hard to create a national state. And so to this day, many states in Latin America, like Colombia, I mean, that's an extreme example, but many Latin American states really have trouble exercising territorial jurisdiction. But the other big factor, I think, really has to do with inequality, because Latin American societies were born unequal. Many of them started out as slave societies. The two big seats of the Spanish government, overseas Spanish government in Peru and in Mexico, were established as basically slave societies in which white settlers used indigenous labor to mine gold and silver and so forth. This was the original birth defect of Latin America. In Brazil, where you didn't have a very large indigenous population, Europeans brought black slaves from Africa in a triangular trade in order to run sugar plantations, which was the basis of the Brazilian economy certainly in the first 100 years or so of its existence. And so you had very large class distinctions that coincided with ethnic divisions, so that the poor people were of a different skin color and a different ethnicity from the rich people. And that is very different from Europe, because in 19th century European development, when you saw the emergence of strong European states, you had this shift from dynastic organization to ethno-nationalist organization as France and Germany and Spain and all these other countries developed. After the French Revolution, basically the peasants and the lords realized that they all spoke French, and there was a levée en masse, and you created a national army and a sense of French culture and identity, because essentially, despite the class differences, everybody was a white French person. You couldn't do that in Latin America. You couldn't do that in Latin America because, first of all, the lords and peasants didn't speak the same languages. The poor people continued to speak their own indigenous languages, and the elites spoke Spanish or Portuguese. And those class divisions really meant that an elite in Latin America was always much more afraid of their own population than they were of the next country over, because first of all, the geography made it hard for that country to invade, and secondly, the real divisions, the really scary divisions, were the people that you were trying to suppress in an extractive economic system. This has had, in a way, devastating effects, because I think this is one of the obstacles to the creation of strong states. I mean, if I had to point to a single weakness in Latin American polities in general, it's actually not democracy. Latin America does pretty well in terms of democracy. I mean, obviously spotty human rights records in many countries and so forth, but compared to other parts of the world, especially compared to Asia, there's a lot of democratic accountability in this region. What is really missing are states, meaning monopolies, legitimate monopolies of force that can exert authority over territory. This has been, and given the fact that this is a region that's been settled for longer than North America is settled, it's not just the passage of time didn't fix this problem. It's an interesting meta-historical question about why strong states never really emerged in Latin America, but I think it's this combination of both physical geography and these internal class divisions that prevented the emergence of strong states, and that continues to happen up until the present moment. And that's something that I think in the end, you're not going to be able to settle some of the basic inequalities and some of the internal peace problems until that kind of authority is somehow established. And by the way, Latin America's had plenty of strong states in the sense of dictatorships and really nasty, authoritarian regimes that were willing to violate human rights and kill opponents and this sort of thing. That's not what I mean by a strong state. What I mean by a strong state is one in the sense of being able to deliver impersonal public goods, roads, hospitals, education, schools, and to do that on an impersonal basis across its territory. That's the characteristic of modern democracies in Europe, in North America. Of course, nobody's perfect, but that's, I think, one of the big accomplishments of democracies in those regions. Very few Latin American countries have been able to achieve that level of state institutionalization, and it becomes, something in which they're trapped in this equilibrium where you can't build a strong state because you don't have the basic political consensus, and the states don't get the support they need to exert their authority, which continues to then disappoint the expectations of citizens and so forth. So I just want to leave you with that thought that the current situation in which internal violence is really the central preoccupation of most countries in Latin America has been true for a very long time. It's been true in a certain sense, really since the original Spanish-Portuguese settlement. I don't want this to be too discouraging because, in fact, there has been progress in many areas. And so, for example, in Colombia, despite the fact that you've got physical geography and all these constraints on state formation, there's been progress in the last 20 years, both in control, not so much in controlling drugs, but certainly in the control of violence and in the ability of the Colombian state to exert its authority in a more coherent way. And I think importantly, in certain Latin American states, there's probably been a shift in the social contract where I think initially, because of the lack of fear of external invasion, a lot of Latin American elites actually didn't want a strong state. They wanted the state to leave them alone so that they could just hold on to their own money, not be taxed, and so forth. And I think that in certain places that is a consensus that's eroded because there has been a recognition that you actually do need state authority if you're going to have basic internal peace. So, like I said, I don't think this has any particular practical implications for the work that you guys are doing, but I do think that it's kind of helpful to have a sort of overview of why I think this region has special challenges that are really different from the challenges that exist in other parts of the world. It's why you can't really import solutions from Asia or Europe or other places to this region because every place is different. So thank you very much.